Tuesday, 2:47 p.m. Deborah Voss stood on my grandfather's bluff in 4-inch heels sinking into red clay, clipboard against her chest like a shield. "Your grandfather's dirt pile has no historic protection, Mr. Dunmore," she said, not looking up. "It's HOA-governed lands now. We decide what stays and what gets graded." 40 view lots, $4.2 million raised in pre-sales. One drainage berm my grandfather built by hand in 1961, bulldozed in an afternoon, and logged on her books as landscaping improvements. By the time the county finished with Deborah Voss, she'd owe $4.2 million in court-ordered restitution and lose every asset she'd built on that bluff. But the number that mattered most to me wasn't the money. It was 17 certified letters I mailed to the HOA board a month before the first storm, describing exactly what would happen to their view decks when the rain came. Nobody opened them. I didn't yell at Deborah Voss that Tuesday. I didn't need to. I spent 31 years in the Army Corps of Engineers teaching soldiers how slopes fail, how water finds the weak seam in clay and pulls everything down with it. All I had to do was wait for autumn. She thought she was standing on solid ground. She was standing on a countdown. My name is Walter Dunmore. Everyone calls me Walt. I'm 63 years old, and I came home to bury my father and stayed to save what was left of my grandfather's ranch. Dunmore Ridge sits above Comal Valley, Texas, on 400 acres my grandfather Silas Dunmore homesteaded in 1911. He wasn't a rich man. He was a man who understood dirt. He dug his own well, built his own house from limestone he hauled up from the creek bed, and spent 2 summers, 1960 and 61, building a drainage berm along the clay bluff above the house. Cedar posts, packed stone, a channel angled just right to carry rainwater away from the slope instead of into it. He used to say, "Water's patient, Walt. It'll wait 100 years to take what it wants. Give it somewhere else to go, and it'll leave you be." I grew up smelling cedar dust and diesel from my father's tractor, hearing the creak of the old porch swing my grandfather built the same year as the berm. 3 transactions of Dunmore's are buried under the live oak at the edge of that bluff. Silas, my grandmother Opal, my father Earl. I used to sit at my grandfather's kitchen table, hand-built in 1899 by a cabinet maker in New Braunfels, running my thumb over a knife scar in the wood older than the house's electricity. That table is the only thing in my house that isn't Army-issue plain. Everything else I own, I could fit in a duffel bag. 31 years in uniform teaches you to travel light, but land you can't pack. Land you inherit, the way you inherit a promise. When I retired and came home, Comal Valley wasn't the sleepy ranch country I remembered. A gated community called Bluffside Estates had grown up along the ridge like kudzu. 40 new houses with 3-car garages and stone facades, and every single one of them backed up to my grandfather's bluff. And running the whole operation, clipboard in hand, driving a white Range Rover with a vanity plate that read HOA Boss, was Deborah Voss. 51 years old, a real estate developer turned HOA president, always in a tailored blazer, even in July heat, always smiling the smile of a woman who has already decided she's right. I didn't know yet that smile was covering a $4.2 million hole. The first letter came on a Thursday, tucked under my windshield wiper like a parking ticket. Notice of violation, unauthorized vegetation encroachment. Fine, $500. My grandfather's berm, apparently, was now unauthorized vegetation because volunteer grasses had grown over the stone. I didn't argue. I photographed the notice, the date stamp, the tire marks in my driveway where somebody's truck had backed in close enough to knock over my mailbox post. 3:12 p.m., my phone said. I wrote it in a notebook I kept in the truck, the same habit the Army beat into me 30 years ago. Document first, react never. 2 weeks later, I drove up to check the bluff and found survey stakes hammered into my grandfather's berm. Bright orange flags. A crew in HOA-branded vests running a small excavator along the slope, clawing at the stone channel my grandfather built with his own hands. I got out of my truck slow. "This is private land," I said, "deeded to my family in 1911. The foreman shrugged. "Got a work order from the HOA, says easement rights for slope stabilization." Deborah Voss arrives 12 minutes later in the Range Rover, heels crunching gravel. "Mr. Dunmore," she said, clipboard already up like a badge. "This berm is a liability. Our engineers say it's obstructing the view corridor for 40 premium lots. We're within our rights under the community covenants." "There's no easement on this parcel," I said. "I checked the deed myself last week." She smiled the way people smile when they've already decided the conversation is over. "Well, we'll let the lawyers sort that out. In the meantime, the work continues." She turned to the foreman. "Keep going." I didn't argue further. I took photographs, time-stamped, GPS tagged, 31 of them, of the excavator, the torn stone, the orange flags, Deborah Voss standing in her heels on my grandfather's grave-adjacent land. I sent a certified letter to the HOA boards that night, citing Texas Water Code Section 11.086 on downstream damage from altered drainage and Texas Property Code provisions on unauthorized entry onto non-easement land. I kept a copy. I always keep a copy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my grandfather's table, running my thumb over that old knife scar, and I thought about the 80 years of rain that berm had turned away. I thought about what happens to wet clay when you cut the toe out from under a slope. I taught it in a classroom in Fort Leonard Wood 100 times. Cut the toe, lose the slope. It wasn't a theory, it was physics. I opened my laptop and started pulling county records. That's when I found her. Her name was Ruth Callahan, 78 years old, widow of a Vietnam veteran, oxygen tank humming beside her recliner, living 3 lots down from the Bluff in a house her husband built in 1974. The HOA had fined her 4 times in 6 months, $200 here, $150 there, for a wheelchair ramp that violated aesthetic guidelines, for a garden hose left visible, for a flag she flew for her late husband that was the wrong size. I found her records buried in the same county filing system where I was pulling Bluffside's plat maps. And that's when the real shape of it started coming into focus. Not just a woman bulldozing an old man's berm out of arrogance, but 40 lots, pre-sold at $105,000 premium each for unobstructed valley views, totaling just over $4.2 million, with the drainage berm removal logged in HOA financial disclosures as a $38,000 landscaping enhancement instead of what it actually was: the demolition of the only thing holding that bluff in place. I sat back in my chair, the porch light flickering through the window, cicadas going in the dark outside, and I felt something settle in my chest that wasn't anger. It was patience. Deborah Voss thought she was selling views. She was selling a countdown, and somewhere in a box in my closet, still wrapped in the same butcher paper my father had used to store it for 40 years, were my grandfather's original drainage schematics from 1961, stamped, dated, and about to become the most expensive piece of paper Deborah Voss had ever ignored. The next morning, I drove down to Ruth Callahan's place, coffee still in the truck's cup holder, going cold. Her oxygen concentrator hummed through the screen door before she even answered it. She was small, silver-haired, wearing her husband's old army field jacket over a house dress, and she looked at me like she was bracing for another citation. "Mr. Dunmore," she said, "if you hear about the fence line, I already told them the ramp isn't coming down. Frank needs it to get his chair through." "I'm not with the HOA, ma'am," I said. "I'm the one they're trying to bulldoze off the bluff." That got a dry laugh out of her, more air than sound. "Well, come in then. Misery loves company." Her kitchen smelled like instant coffee and machine oil, a shelf of Frank's medals dusted and squared away like a shrine. She showed me the citations, 4 of them, folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft. $200 for the ramp, $150 for a garden hose, another for a flag Deborah Voss's inspector called oversized, though it was the same flag Frank had flown since 1991. They keep saying it's for property values, Ruth said, staring at the stack. Whose property? Not mine. I've been here 50 years. I told her what I'd found in the county filings, the 40 lots, the $4.2 million, the berm logged as landscaping. She went quiet a long moment, hand pressed flat against the table, like she needed it to stay upright. That woman smiled at my husband's funeral, Ruth said finally. Told me the flagpole was a liability. I didn't say much after that. I didn't need to. I drove home with my jaw tight, thinking about cut slopes and buried drainage, about a berm built by a man who understood water better than anyone with a real estate license ever would. Somewhere behind my house, in a closet that still smelled of cedar and old paper, my grandfather's schematics were waiting. I hadn't unwrapped them yet, but I knew exactly where they were. The crew came back on a Thursday afternoon, 3 trucks parked crooked along the access road, and this time Deborah Voss brought a locksmith. I heard about it before I saw it. Ruth Callahan called me from her kitchen phone, voice shaking behind the hum of her oxygen concentrator. Walt, they're here. They've got papers. They're saying I'm in violation of a lien. I drove down with my dash cam running, the way I'd run it every day since the excavator first tore into my grandfather's berm. By the time I pulled up, 2 HOA contracted workers were already unbolting Ruth's wheelchair ramp from her porch, and Deborah Voss stood in the yard in a cream blazer, clipboard against her hip, watching like she was overseeing a home renovation instead of stripping an 80-year-old widow of her only way in and out of her own house. Ma'am, you're in arrears on your HOA assessments, Voss was saying, loud enough for the whole cul-de-sac to hear. The ramp is being repossessed as unauthorized structure until the balance is paid. My husband built that ramp, Ruth said, standing in her doorway, oxygen tube trailing behind her like a leash. I can't get down my own steps without it. Voss didn't even look up from her clipboard. That's not my problem. Take it up with the board. I stood at the edge of the yard and I didn't say a word. I filmed all of it. The locksmith prying at brackets, the workers loading aluminium ramp sections into a truck bed, Deborah's clipboard, her cream blazer, her voice carrying over a woman gasping for breath on her own porch. 40 onward seconds of footage. I didn't need 42. That night, I sat at my grandfather's table and finally unwrapped the butcher paper. Inside were his 1961 drainage schematics, hand-inked, the ink browned with age but still legible, channel depth, slope angle, load calculations scratched in pencil in the margin. Underneath them, my own report, printed and mailed 6 weeks earlier. An independent geotechnical assessment I'd done as a courtesy, warning the HOA board in writing that removing the toe of the slope without replacing lateral support would trigger failure under saturated conditions. Texas Water Code Section 11.086. Texas Engineering Practice Act, unlicensed grading of a regulated slope. I'd sent it certified, signature required. 17 letters, 17 return receipts, all signed by the HOA's own management company. I didn't need to threaten Deborah Voss. I needed the rain to arrive with witnesses already in place. I called the county floodplain administrator and filed a formal complaint, attaching my report and photos of the excavated berm. I called the Comal County Sheriff's Office and reported the unlawful removal of an accessibility structure from Ruth Callahan's property, citing possible elder exploitation under Texas Human Resources Code Section 48.051. I called a reporter I knew from the local paper, a woman named Denise Ochoa, who'd covered flooding stories in the valley for a decade, and I sent her the footage, the schematics, and my report, all time-stamped, all documented. Then I did the one thing I do best. I waited for the sky to turn the color of wet slate, and I checked the forecast every morning like a man checking his own pulse. The storm came on a Saturday night in late October, 3 inches in 4 hours, the kind of rain my grandfather used to call a real gully washer. I stood on my porch with a headlamp and watched water sheet down what was left of the bluff, no berm to slow it, no channel to carry it wide. Somewhere below me, 40 view deck homes sat on clay that had held for 80 years because somebody understood what he was doing with a shovel and a plan. Somebody else had cut it out from under them for a better sightline. At 2:47 a.m., the slope let go. I heard it before I saw it, a low groan, then a crack like a rifle shot, then the long, wet roar of a hillside deciding it was done waiting. I ran to the fence line with my phone already recording. Below me, 3 of Bluffside's view homes were sliding, slow and terrible. Decks tearing loose from foundations, a swimming pool folding in on itself like wet cardboard. Mud swallowed a mailbox row whole. Nobody was hurt. The HOA had, ironically, sent an emergency evacuation notice hours earlier when the county issued a flash flood warning. But the street, the decks, the $4.2 million dream of unobstructed valley views, all of it went down the hill in the dark. By sunrise, county inspectors, sheriff's deputies, and Denise Ochoa with a camera crew were standing at the top of what used to be Ridgeview Terrace, staring down at a mudslide that had swallowed 6 homes and cracked the foundations of a dozen more. Deborah Voss arrived in the Range Rover, blazer replaced by a rain jacket, clipboard still somehow in her hand, and she said the words I'd been waiting 3 months to hear. "This is an act of God. Nobody could have predicted this." I stepped forward with a manila folder. Inside were my grandfather's 1961 schematics and my own report, both already filed with the county, both already in Denise Ochoa's inbox, both already timestamped in the sheriff's case file. "Somebody did predict it," I said, in writing, 6 weeks before the rain. The county building inspector took the folder from my hands and started reading it right there in the mud, deputies at his shoulder, Denise's camera rolling. Voss's face went the color of the clay behind her. "You cut the toe of a stabilized slope to sell a view," I said. "My grandfather spent 2 summers building what you took out in an afternoon. I sent you the math. You signed for it." "This isn't," she started. 40 lots, I said. $4.2 million in pre-sales. A drainage berm logged as $38,000 in landscaping. I imagine the district attorney is going to want to see those disclosure filings. The sheriff's deputy who'd been standing behind her the whole time, the one there originally for the elder exploitation complaint regarding Ruth Callahan's ramp, stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs already off his belt. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to turn around." Denise Ochoa's camera caught every second of it. Deborah Voss, cream rain jacket, clipboard finally falling into the mud, hands cuffed behind her back, in front of the ruins of the street she'd sold as paradise. The investigation took 4 months. What came out of it was worse than even I expected. Deborah Voss had not only misclassified the berm demolition as landscaping, she'd forged 2 engineering sign-offs to satisfy county permitting, using the stamp of a retired engineer who hadn't practiced in 6 years and didn't know his name was on the documents. She'd also filed an insurance claim on the HOA's master policy for storm damage 3 days after the slide, seeking $600,000 in coverage for infrastructure she herself had unlawfully removed. She was convicted on charges including theft by deception, securities fraud related to the lot pre-sales, forgery of a professional engineer's seal, and elder exploitation under Texas Human Resources Code Section 48.051 for the seizure of Ruth Callahan's ramp. The court ordered $4.2 million in restitution to the 40 affected homeowners, plus an additional $38,000 specifically earmarked for Ruth Callahan for property damage and pain and suffering. Deborah Voss was sentenced to 7 years, with the judge noting in his ruling that her actions showed a pattern of predation against the most vulnerable residents under her supposed protection. The retired engineer whose forged stamp she'd used was cleared of wrongdoing, but barred from any future consulting role after admitting he'd left his seal unsecured in an unlocked drawer. 2 HOA board members who'd approved the pre-sale contracts without reviewing engineering documentation were removed from the board and fined for negligence, though neither faced criminal charges. The 40 lot owners got their money back, minus what it cost to demolish what remained of their slipped foundations. Most sold what was left of their lands and moved on. A few stayed and asked me, of all people, to help design a new drainage system for the slope, properly permitted, properly engineered, built the way my grandfather would have built it if he'd had a soldier's field manual instead of a shovel and good sense. Ruth Callahan got her ramp rebuilt within the week, paid for by the court settlement, and 6 weeks later, the remaining homeowners elected her the new president of what was left of the Bluffside Estates HOA. She called me the day it happened, breathless with laughter over the hum of her oxygen machine. Frank would have loved this, she said. The old bird who kept them honest, running the whole roost now. I go up to the Bluff most evenings now, past the live oak where 3 generations of Dunmores are buried, past the new berm we built together, cedar posts, packed stone, the same angle my grandfather drew in pencil 60 years ago. The rain comes and it goes exactly where we tell it to go. I sit at that old 1899 table sometimes with my grandfather's schematics spread out under the lamp, running my thumb over the knife scar in the wood, and I think about what he used to say. Water's patient. It'll wait 100 years to take what it wants. Give it somewhere else to go, and it'll leave you be. People ask me what I learned from all this. I tell them 3 things. Document everything, even when nobody's watching, especially when nobody's watching. Never mistake silence for surrender. Sometimes it's just a man waiting for the right storm. And the ground always remembers who built it right and who cut corners for a better view. Last week, a woman named Carla Ibsen showed up at my gate, said she used to work in the Bluffside sales office. Said there was another development 3 counties over. Same investors, same story. Already selling lots on a slope nobody's inspected. She had a folder in her hands. I haven't opened it yet.